Hello, everyone, and welcome into CrushTheStreet.com. We got a special guest here today to extrapolate what we need to know in these ever-changing markets. And these markets are chaotic, they're crazy, and we're even seeing the stock markets hit new highs as we speak. And I want to get Bill Holter insight on this. His website is jsmindset.com, and he's an expert from precious metals to geopolitics to the markets, real unfiltered insight on the economy. Returning guest, actually, Bill Holter. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Bill, these markets, as I said, seem to be dependent on corruption and manipulation to create a perception of normalcy. And something that I thought was very interesting was that 1 week after Clinton had her pass from the FBI on her investigation, the U.S. stocks hit new highs. And one thing I expected was that the stock market propaganda would continue on longer if we had an establishment candidate in the office, because, that's the person who's getting the money from the banks and Wall Street. And I assume that we would actually see the markets do better or kind of hang on because of the fact that she is in, their candidate is in. But I got to ask you, what are your thoughts on the U.S. stocks hitting all-time highs here?
Well, if you look so far in the last 2 weeks, this year, but in particular the last 2 weeks, last 6 weeks, the volume has been almost non-existent. I mean, volume is like half of what it had been. In the old days when markets were not completely rigged, this would have been, or would certainly have been, a bad sign. Stocks making new highs on non-existent volume. You get any type of selling, any real volume to the sell side, they'll tear this market apart.
One of the things that Jim Rogers actually pointed out is that in 2015, for every two stocks that were down, only one was up, and the average was okay. And same thing this year, we're seeing more stocks down on average than are actually up. And
right, very poor breath.
Yeah. So in something I wanted to talk to you about, Bill, is you've pointed towards the Exchange Stabilization Fund as kind of this mystery source of money. I mean, do you see this as a possibility of what is driving stock prices higher here in 2016?
Well, it's not a possibility. It's probably, call it 100% probability. Because if you look, I think there was an article last week in Zero Hedge where the last 17 weeks have seen outflow of investor monies via funds. And we also know that the volume has been very light. I mean, where's the buying coming from? That's really the only source.
Yeah. I'm wondering how far they will take this manipulation. I mean, this was a fund that was created in 1934, years before its time, essentially, for what we're seeing today. I wonder what type of situations and funds or organizations that the powers that be are planning and implementing today that we may not find out for a few years down the line. You don't have to necessarily answer that.
Well, we already know for a fact that both the Bank of Japan and the Central Bank of Switzerland are buying equities directly.
Wow.
I think one of the largest shareholders in Apple is the Central Bank of Switzerland.
Yeah. Well, that is amazing, how far things have gotten. And one of the things that you've pointed out is just the ridiculousness of negative interest rates, the impossibility of it. And I know you've explained it basically as debt is now, if you were to look at it from, the definition of future value and present value, debt is now worth more than cash. And,
right.
And I mean, if you'd like to expand on that and your thoughts on it, that's just, it's amazing the way you put that. But go ahead.
Well, that's what negative interest rates really are saying, is that debt itself is better than the cash that it promises to pay. And I equate it to like a snake eating its own tail. given enough time with negative rates, the system implodes upon itself because it eats itself up.
Yeah, and the U.S. is dependent on, doubling its debt every few years here to get the growth it sees in the stock market. And I think in the first quarter of GDP, it took $10 of debt to get $1 worth of GDP growth. And, in a real world, go ahead.
It used to be that they would add $1 of debt and they'd get $4 or $5 of GDP growth.
Wow.
Now it's $1 of debt and they get 10 cents or zero.
Yeah. You know what? Oh, go ahead.
You need to remember, though, that each year when we have a fiscal deficit, that basically it's counted in GDP. So where would we have been all these years if we didn't have deficits? We wouldn't have had any growth.
Yeah. And, if we would have had a fundamentally sound economy, we wouldn't be in these extreme situations we are now where, the bubble is just on the verge of bursting and, the aftermath is just untold at this point. And speaking of that, the next potential big shocker to the markets looks like it might come from Europe, Deutsche Bank. And, we know that Deutsche Bank's chief economist is now calling for 150 billion euro bailout, for European banks, and Europe just seems to be leading the way down the economic collapse for the world. And I actually would have thought it was going to come from the U.S., and maybe you can say that it did come from the U.S. if you start it back at Lehman or Bear Stearns or one of those moments. But do you suppose this bank going under will shock the markets to a large extent and really get this collapse underway?
Well, I assure you, if Deutsche Bank goes under, the markets will close. That's guaranteed. You're talking about a bank with $70 trillion worth of derivatives. So if Deutsche Bank fails, the markets will close. I don't think that Deutsche Bank will be the one to fail and start it. It looks now likely that there are Italian banks that will probably fail and start the dominoes, which may last a few days or a week or 2 weeks. But the derivatives chain will break, and when the chain breaks, the markets will close.
Wow.
Banks will close, the financial system will shut down, and we will have a reset.
Yeah. I guess I've just been pondering exactly how this will play out, and that's interesting, the chain of events that you bring up there.
Let me go back just a second. You mentioned that we have a fundamentally unsound economy. That's true, but the real foundation, what's fundamentally unsound, is money itself. Mm-hmm. That's you hear money is the root of all evil. I'm going to say that the fact that we have bad money is the root of all the problems.
Yeah. Well, and actually along the lines of what I was just about to say is that, when central banks respond to the money issue, they're going to print. And, I tend to think, and, I've heard this, I've actually stole this from another guest of mine, the U.S. dollar will be the best horse in the glue factory. And you know what? I tend to think and agree with that because I feel like the rest of the world will flood into U.S. dollars. But the U.S. still is dealing with such a massive credit issue, credit problem, derivatives bubble, that it too is going to deal with a financial crisis. And, central banks will likely respond with massive amounts of QE, money printing. And really, the people, the middle class and poor, will get crushed in that situation, and it'll only be the 1% of 1% that continue to do well under this current system where, the massive money printing is benefiting the top 1%, 1% of 1%. So, any thoughts, additional thoughts on that reset you're talking about?
Well, what you're talking about, the additional QE, there are plans out there already. You've heard in the last week or two the term helicopter money.
Mm-hmm.
And really, all that is monetization. And all throughout history, monetization does not work. It's just basically debasing the currency. So all fiat currencies are going to get destroyed, the dollar included. And when you're saying that the middle class and the poor are going to get crushed, you're absolutely right, because their savings will be crushed.
Yeah. Yeah, and so just because you're in the U.S., it doesn't necessarily mean you're in a safe haven. You still need to be protected because
there is no safe haven anywhere in the world.
Yeah.
There really isn't. I mean, if you want to leap forward after the reset, probably the best currency is going to end up being the Chinese yuan. And the reason I say that is because they've accumulated so much gold over the last 5 or 10 years that if they revalue gold higher, they can back their currency with gold. And I'm convinced that the U.S. no longer has the gold. I believe it's gone.
Yeah. You know what? I want to redirect our attention back to the presidential campaign. And, we know Hillary Clinton got off scot-free, lying to the people, jeopardizing national security, and accepting millions of dollars from conflicting parties. On Republican side, we are seeing news or rumors that, we have tens of thousands of people being bussed into protests at the Republican convention funded by the one and only globalist George Soros. I want to get your thoughts. How crazy do you suspect this election to get? And I suppose as a result of a reaction to the craziness of the global economic system.
Well, I wrote about this yesterday in a public article, so you should be able to find it at any of the financial sites. And it basically talked about the rule of law and the fact that now publicly in the United States, the rule of law is no more. We saw that going back to Justice Scalia with no autopsy. I mean, how is it possible that the public demand an autopsy for Prince, but they don't care about Justice Scalia? You've got the Hillary Clinton thing. You've got Supreme Court Justice Ginsburg trashing Donald Trump. I mean, is that an impartial... is that impartiality? No, it's not. I've said since last fall that I believed the odds of actually having an election this coming November was about a coin flip. The 50-50 chance of actually having the election. I'm going to say now those odds have increased to 65 or 70% that we do not have an election this fall.
Wow.
Now, whether it be because of unrest, I think you're going to see massive unrest in the coming weeks. I think like you were saying, they're going to bus in 10,000 people or more into the Republican convention. It's all set up to impose martial law. I believe it's tomorrow, the 15th. There's something like 30 or 35 cities where there are big BLM protests planned. And just in passing, the mayor of Atlanta said something about calling in the National Guard. Well, let me tell you this. Once the National Guard is called in somewhere, they're going to be called in everywhere, and that is your groundwork for martial law. Will they cancel the election during martial law? If they, in my opinion, if they truly believe that Hillary is leading in the polls, there will be an election. If not, there won't be an election. And I believe the polls are completely whacked out. I think Brexit, the vote on Brexit, is certainly will be a precursor to the Trump-Clinton election. I mean, people are pissed, and they don't want an existing, somebody who's a career politician. So I think, in my opinion, I think true polling numbers would show Trump ahead by 10 points or into the double digits. And if I'm right and that's the case, I do believe that the election will be canceled somehow, some way.
Wow.
And let me just say one more thing. If Donald Trump is not a Trojan horse, many people say that he is. I'm not sure one way or the other. But if he's not a Trojan horse and he were to get elected and return us to the rule of law, you would see the dirtiest stuff come to light and people prosecuted and go to jail. I mean, the numbers would be staggering.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I was going to actually ask you if Donald Trump isn't a Trojan horse, which is it's worth bringing up because I know some of us are looking at some of the things that might kind of tie him to the establishment, but I think a lot of us are hopeful that he isn't, and he's outside of the establishment, and he is what he's saying. I'm wondering if he's just going to be killed.
I've said that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said back in November when it looked like he was the front runner. I said that if you won if you got close to winning, there'd be a high probability of him being killed.
Yeah. Well, Bill, I want to just kind of close with this question here. How much control do you believe that these powers have, and can this control be contained much longer?
In the immediate right now, I think they have 100% control. Tomorrow morning it could be different. And I've said all along, once once we run out of gold and once we don't deliver gold that is purchased for delivery, the jig will be up and all control will be lost because all confidence will be lost. It's all about confidence. And the suppression scheme on gold has been in the reverse. It's been propping up the dollar.
Yeah.
So I believe that all markets are rigged, all markets are controlled, but that control will be lost, and once it's lost, markets will close, and we will have a reset. And you're not going to believe your eyes at the values of various things in relation to other things. Paper assets versus hard assets, real estate, et cetera, et cetera. It'll be like night and day from one system to the opening or reopening of the markets.
Yeah. Well, and I've been trying to remind people too that $1,300 gold might seem expensive, considering you could have bought it for somewhere in the 1200s not that many days ago on a premium basis. But when you look back and you see gold prices much higher, you're going to be begging to buy it for $1,300, and we know there's going to be a mad scramble for the exits. And when we do see that reset happen, the fear trade, the transfer of wealth from financial assets over onto hard assets, you're going to want to be positioned ahead of time. So, Bill, I'd like to just get your closing thoughts here, and if you want to share a little bit with the audience on, JS Mindset and the projects you're working on, feel free to do so.
Okay. Just to finish up on what you were saying, in the words of Reg Howe, you could wake up one morning, gold be $4,500 bid, and nothing offered. That's what's going to happen, is that gold and silver will be unbuyable because there's not going to be anybody willing to sell. So there will be a vacuum. To read my work, here are interviews. Jim St. Clair and I do an interview. We just do a crosstalk once a week. It's usually for about 45 minutes or so. You can go to JS Mindset. That's JSMINESET.com. We have a public side with all kinds of information, and then there's a subscription side. I believe it's $119 for the year. Most all of my work is on the subscription side. I write 2 or 3 times a week, and Jim and I do a a weekly interview, which is for subscribers only. Just listening to Jim once a week is worth the price of admission on its own. Jim is he's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, Bill, I gotta thank you for coming on the show with me today. You don't hold back. You are unfiltered, and your insight on the economy is like no other. So I really do appreciate you taking the time with me today, and I look forward to future conversations as well. As this whole situation unfolds here, we're documenting it on a daily basis here. So thank you so much, Bill.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into CrushTheStreet.com. We got a special guest here today to extrapolate what we need to know in these ever-changing markets. And these markets are chaotic, they're crazy, and we're even seeing the stock markets hit new highs as we speak. And I want to get Bill Holter insight on this. His website is jsmindset.com, and he's an expert from precious metals to geopolitics to the markets, real unfiltered insight on the economy. Returning guest, actually, Bill Holter. Thanks for coming on the show.
On non-existent volume, you get any type of selling, any real volume to the sell side, they'll tear this market apart.
One of the things that Jim Rogers actually pointed out is that in 2015, for every two stocks that were down, only one was up, and the average was okay. And same thing this year, we're seeing more stocks down on average than are actually up. And
right, very poor breath.
Yeah. So in something I wanted to talk to you about, Bill, is you've pointed towards the Exchange Stabilization Fund as assumed that we would actually see the markets do better or kind of hang on because of the fact that she is in, their candidate is in. But I got to ask you, what are your thoughts on the U.S. stocks hitting all-time highs here?
Well, if you look so far in the last 2 weeks, actually this year, but in particular the last 2 weeks, last 6 weeks, the volume has been almost non-existent. I mean, volume is like half of what it had been. In the old days when markets were not completely rigged, this would have been, or would certainly have been, a bad sign. Stocks making new highs.
Kind of this mystery source of money. I mean, do you see this as a possibility of what is driving stock prices higher here in 2016?
Well, it's not a possibility. It's probably, call it 100% probability. Because if you look, I think there was an article last week in Zero Hedge where the last 17 weeks have seen outflow of investor monies via funds. And we also know that the volume has been very light. I mean, where's the buying coming from? Thanks for having me.
Bill, these markets, as I said, seem to be dependent on corruption and manipulation to create a perception of normalcy. And something that I thought was very interesting was that 1 week after Clinton had her pass from the FBI on her investigation, the U.S. stocks hit new highs. And one thing I expected was that the stock market propaganda would continue on longer if we had an establishment candidate in the office, because that's the person who's getting the money from the banks and Wall Street, and I